Imagine standing alone beneath towering pines as daylight drains from the forest, the air cooling and the familiar world dissolving into shadow. Because before we hear anything unsettling, we must understand the silence itself. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every breath you take. And that is where our story begins, deep in a remote stretch of woodland far from highways, towns, or cell service, where solo campers often go seeking peace, clarity, or escape, but sometimes find something far more disturbing. And before we go any further, welcome to the channel, where we investigate real unexplained encounters, unsettling recordings, and the thin line between natural phenomena and the unknown. So, if you value grounded storytelling without exaggeration, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future investigations. Because tonight, we're not showing you dramatic reenactments or fabricated sounds. We're presenting raw audio captured during real solo camping trips. Recordings that were never intended to become evidence of anything unusual. Only documentation of the forest's natural soundscape. And yet, as night settled in, something began to emerge. Something began to emerge, easily dismissed, because forests are never truly silent. There are insects clicking in rhythmic patterns, distant owls calling to one another, branches shifting as temperatures change, and wind weaving through needles like a slow breath. But what makes the first recording unsettling isn't volume or clarity. It's timing, a faint interruption occurring during a moment when everything else abruptly falls quiet, as if the forest itself paused to listen. And the sound that replaces that silence is neither animal nor mechanical in any recognizable way. A low tonal fluctuation that rises and falls with irregular spacing, not like a call, not like a machine, but almost like an attempt at mimicry. And at the time of recording, the camper reacts calmly, whispering observations into the microphone, attempting to rationalize what they're hearing, attributing it to distant wildlife or wind resonance. Yet, what's notable is the sudden absence of all other ambient noise during the event. No insects, no birds, no rustling leaves. A phenomenon that experienced outdoorsmen often describe as the dead zone. Moments when ecosystems seem to shut down simultaneously, usually in response to a perceived threat. And this isn't presented as proof of anything supernatural, but it raises an important question as we move forward. Why would the forest fall silent for a sound that doesn't match any known predator patterns? And more importantly, why does the sound appear to respond to human presence, shifting slightly when the camper adjusts position or breathes more audibly? And as night deepens and the fire dims to embers, this first encounter sets the tone for everything that follows. Because once you recognize that the silence itself may be listening back, every sound becomes suspect. Every recording becomes a question rather than an answer. And the woods no longer feel empty, they feel occupied. As the night progresses and fatigue sets in, the mind becomes vulnerable to misinterpretation. A fact well documented by sleep science and survival psychology. Which is why the second phase of these recordings is particularly disturbing. Not because it relies on fear, but because it resists easy explanation. Captured several hours after midnight, when temperatures drop and human cognitive filters weaken, the audio reveals a sequence of sounds that resemble fragmented speech patterns without forming recognizable language. Not clear words, but tonal rises and falls that mirror conversational cadence. The kind of rhythm you'd expect if someone were speaking just beyond comprehension. And what makes this unsettling isn't the idea of whispers, but the technical analysis of the waveform itself, which shows irregular modulation inconsistent with wind, insects, or mammalian vocal cords. And while pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns where none exists, is a valid explanation, it doesn't account for the directional movement recorded across stereo channels, as if the sound source slowly circled the campsite perimeter, never approaching directly, never retreating fully. And during this period, the camper becomes audibly tense, their breathing shallow, narration slowing, sentences trailing off as listening takes priority over speaking. Because when you're alone in the woods at night, instinct overrides logic. And what's especially notable is that the camper does not immediately flee or panic, instead choosing to remain still, minimizing noise, a response consistent with prey behavior rather than curiosity, suggesting that on some level, conscious or not, the body perceived these sounds as potential threat indicators. And then comes the most debated clip in the entire recording set. A brief sequence where a low-frequency hum appears beneath the ambient layer. Not loud enough to be obvious, but present enough to be detected during audio isolation. A hum that maintains a consistent pitch while the environment around it fluctuates. Unlike generators, aircraft, or distant vehicles, which exhibit Doppler shift or rhythmic pulsing, this sound remains steady, mechanical in consistency, yet organic in texture, leading some audio analysts to suggest atmospheric resonance, while others point to infrastructure interference. Though maps show no nearby installations for miles, and again, no definitive conclusion is offered here. Only the uncomfortable reality that these sounds exist. They were captured, and they resist classification. And perhaps the most unsettling moment occurs when the camper whispers into the microphone, not narrating, but asking softly, "Did you hear that too?" Despite being completely alone, a question not meant for the audience, but spoken instinctively, as if expecting an answer. And while no audible response follows, the forest once again falls into unnatural silence, reinforcing the recurring pattern that whatever is producing these sounds appears only when everything else withdraws, leaving us with a deeply unsettling possibility. Not that something is stalking campers, but that something may be listening, evaluating, and choosing when to make itself known. Morning eventually arrives, as it always does, washing the forest in pale light and restoring a sense of normalcy that feels almost deceptive. Because daylight doesn't erase what was heard, it merely makes it harder to feel afraid of it. And in the final segment of this investigation, we step away from the campsite and examine the psychological and environmental aftermath of these recordings. Because the most lasting impact isn't fear, it's doubt, the kind that lingers long after logic returns. And in post-trip interviews, The campers describe a shared sensation, not of being chased or threatened, but of being observed, studied, a sensation that didn't vanish when they returned home, affecting sleep, attention, and even their desire to revisit the outdoors alone. And from a scientific perspective, we explore grounded explanations, including rare nocturnal animals with atypical vocalizations, acoustic shadow zones created by terrain, temperature inversion layers that carry sound unpredictably, and even auditory hallucinations induced by isolation and exhaustion, all of which are plausible and documented phenomena. Yet none fully account for the consistent patterns across different locations, different nights, and different recording equipment, which is where this story resists closure. Because unresolved does not mean supernatural, it means incomplete, and that distinction matters, especially in a world eager to assign labels before understanding mechanisms. And as we review the final audio clip recorded just before sunrise, there's one last anomaly, a faint tonal shift that fades precisely as the first bird call breaks the silence, as if whatever presence existed during the night withdrew the moment the forest reclaimed its daytime hierarchy, reinforcing the idea that these sounds, whatever their source, belong exclusively to the darkness. And as we conclude, we leave you not with answers, but with an invitation, because the wilderness is vast, largely unmonitored, and still poorly understood at night. And if these recordings teach us anything, it's that silence isn't absence. It's a condition, one that can change without warning. So, if you've ever experienced unexplained sounds while camping, hiking, or living near dense woodland, share your experience in the comments. Because collective patterns reveal more than isolated fear. And if you value calm, evidence-based explorations of the unexplained, make sure you're subscribed, because the next investigation goes even deeper into places where sound behaves in ways we still can't explain. And until then, remember this: the woods don't need to chase you to unsettle you. Sometimes all they need to do is whisper back,